Good morning. I love Sunday mornings. There's something so unique and special about having a set apart hour in our week to focus on God, right? For most of us, it's probably the only time this week that we are going to sit mostly undistracted, right? We have our phones put away, or our kids aren't asking us for snacks right now. Shout out to LT Kids, they're amazing. We're not focused on work right now or making our grocery list. Like, we're just here to see what God has for us. And Sundays are so special and so unique in that way. I think sometimes we're tempted to think that Sunday is the day that I connect with Jesus, right? Like, I'm gonna come on Sunday because I need to feel closer to him. I need to experience him today. And I want to challenge that thought a little bit and have us expand it to the fact that we can experience Jesus every single day beyond Sunday. That our hope is that Sundays would fill us up, be a launching off point as we go into the rest of our week, right? And today we are continuing our series. We're in week 3 of Everyday Jesus, where we're looking in the Bible at how Jesus lived his everyday life while he was on earth. And therefore, how should we live every day with Jesus? I don't know about you, but oftentimes my Monday through Saturday is really hectic. I have so many things going on that I'm trying to balance and scramble, and there's so many good things too in my everyday life, right? Some of the best things in my life right now are depicted in this picture. This is my sweet family, my very patient, loving husband, Bennett, and we have 2 young children who are 3 and 7. And I love being a mom. Like, I really, truly love spending time with my children. They are such a gift to me. And also, sometimes I would love to have like 10 minutes to cook dinner uninterrupted, to go to the bathroom by myself without an audience, to have a conversation with my husband without shouting over each other, right? But my kids, they're little right now. They're in this season where they need me all the time. And so I'm finding that my daily rhythms, my quote unquote quiet time with the Lord is not quiet. You can see like all the scribbles on my Bible. My kids need me. They're interrupting me all the time, every day. And a few months ago, I found myself starting to get increasingly frustrated by these precious little interruptions. And it was during that time that I was introduced to this tiny little book called The Domestic Monastery. And what this book was doing is it was saying that being a parent, specifically a parent to young children, is similar to being a monk in a monastery. Stick with me here for a minute. So if a monk is someone who goes and they live in a set-apart place with other monks, and they're in this monastery specifically to get away from the worldly distractions, right? So that they can just focus on the simplicity of life and that they can hear more from God. Like, they really focus on contemplative prayer and being in the presence of Jesus. And yes, I know that still does not sound like parenting, but I'm getting there. In a monastery, they have a bell. The monastic bell goes off multiple times throughout the day. And every time the bell rings, the monks are forced to drop whatever it is that they're doing and move on to the next thing. If they were in the middle of cooking a meal for their community and they weren't finished yet, and the bell rings, time to move on. If they had just fallen asleep and the bell rings and it's time for prayer, they have to get up immediately. They move on. Now that I can relate to, right? Every single time my kids come up and they interrupt me, I am forced to come outside of whatever it is that I was trying to do, that I was trying to focus on, and I'm forced to be present with them in a moment that I wasn't planning on. And so in this book, the essence here is that every grab of a hand, every interruption to a task with, "Mommy, I need you." Every cry for a need to be met is the ringing of that monastic bell. And it's the reminder that our time is not our own. That our time is not our own, that we get interrupted all the time. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately when my kids ask me and they need me. And I also want to be honest that when my kids are having a meltdown and I'm trying to cook dinner, my first instinct is not, "Oh, sweet little bell, let me turn around and pay attention to you." Like often my first thought is, I don't have time for this right now. But Jesus has been teaching me that through the interruptions that happen in my everyday life, that he's actually able to draw me closer through these interruptions. And so I want us to look at a story today together where we see, how did Jesus handle interruptions in his life? In his 33-ish years on this earth, Jesus was interrupted a lot. And we're gonna look at just one story today in Mark chapter 5. We're gonna begin in verse 21. The verses leading up to where we're at today, Jesus was across the Sea of Galilee, and he had just healed a man from demon possession. All right, this is a point in Jesus' ministry where his popularity is rising. With most of the people, they have known that Jesus has performed some miracles. He's done some healing. They see him as a great teacher. And so people are starting to flock around him. So that's where our story picks up in verse 21, chapter 5 of Mark. It says, "When Jesus had crossed again into the boat on the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus," everybody say Jairus. Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. So this is what happens. So Jesus just gets off of this boat. I don't know what it is that Jesus was planning on doing that day, but I would assume if he sees a giant crowd gathering for him on the shore, that he probably thought he'd be teaching that day. Maybe he came up with the most brilliant sermon in the boat as he was making his way across the sea. He arrives, this crowd immediately surrounds him, waiting, what is it that Jesus is going to do? But then before Jesus is able to do anything that he had maybe planned on, we meet this man. What was his name? Jairus. Jairus is a synagogue leader. That means he was an important man. He was a lay leader in the synagogue. This was a man who had position, power, but here we see him risking all of that. See, Jesus was not very popular among the synagogue leaders. And by Jairus coming out in such a public way, and you see where it said that there was a large crowd that pressed in on him. I want you to think of the biggest crowd that you've been in. Probably the biggest one for me that I personally experienced would be like a Disneyland on the 4th of July, fireworks night type of crowd, right? Where you are just elbow to elbow, knee to knee. You can like smell what somebody has just eaten off their breath. Like it is all around you. Everyone is pressed in on together. So I picture Jairus just kind of like shoving and poking, not caring who he is throwing out of his way, who he's hurting, who sees him. And then when he gets to Jesus, he falls at his feet. Now, my first thought is that just sounds like a desperate parent, right? And partly it was, but also falling at the feet of a rabbi, of a teacher back in that day, like Jesus was. If you're falling at the feet of him, it's basically saying that Jairus was worshiping Jesus, right? That he was showing him respect, that he was acknowledging, Jesus, you are the only chance that I have. You're the only chance that I have. I need you. So he's coming and he is interrupting Jesus. Don't know what Jesus was planning on doing, but I do know that Jairus did not have an appointment that day, right? He did not have an appointment with Jesus. He was desperate. He pushed his way through the crowd. And what do we see Jesus doing in response to this interruption? It says, so he went with him. Because Jesus creates space for interruptions. I think so often, one of our biggest problems that we face in our culture today is that we're too busy. And again, myself too, like we are so busy. I think sometimes we don't stop to help someone or we don't listen to someone sharing their story, not because we're not able or we don't care or we don't want to somewhere inside of us, but we think we don't have the time. Right? I was thinking this week how many times if I had a friend call me on the phone and I'm like, oh, I know I need to respond, but like right now I'm in the middle of something. We are so busy and we're so hurried all of the time. And when we live that way constantly, we're not making space for interruptions. Jairus is asking for a miracle here. He is interrupting Jesus, expectant that Jesus is going to come show up and have a miracle. And Jesus is always creating space for that. So I'm wondering, how can we be creating space for interruptions in our lives? Speaking of interruptions, Mark, the writer of this gospel, he writes this text in an interesting way. Basically, what he's doing right now, as we head into verse 25, it's like you take your camera, we're focused on Jairus, and now we're going to pan it around, and all of a sudden, there's a new character in the very next verse, verse 25. Now, there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better. So we see this woman. She's not named. We can't repeat her name out loud because they didn't tell us. See, Jairus was given a name, and he was identified by his position. But this woman, she's identified here by her problem. Right? It says that she was hemorrhaging. Some of the translations tell us that she was the woman with the issue of blood. She was described by her issue. Most scholars think that it was some sort of uterine hemorrhage, so she was bleeding from the inside. You couldn't tell from the outside, but for 12 years, she was bleeding. Also, for those 12 years, she would have been considered ceremonially unclean. According to Old Testament laws, basically what that means is kind of picture my cute little 3-year-old rolling around all in the mud, getting dirt all over him, and then he comes up and he gives me a big hug. What am I now? Not clean, right? I am muddy, it's all over me. And so that is how this woman would have been depicted. Anything that she touched, because she was bleeding on the inside for so many years, according to the Old Testament laws, anything she touched, anyone she touched, would have been considered also unclean. When you're unclean, you can't go into places of worship. And so it's very likely that this woman would have been isolated. And mentioning this woman here in verse 25 seems strange at first, right? It seems like an interruption to the story. Like, we're on our way to a miracle here, right? We are going to see a daughter be healed. But there is such a sweet connection between the two stories. We'll get to it later. Mark tells us that the daughter, guess how old she was? She was 12. Did you catch how long had this woman been bleeding for? 12 years. So the very same year that this little girl was born was the same year that this woman started to have her issue of blood. For 12 years, this little girl lived with her parents who adored her. We know this because they would do anything for her. They are risking everything to come here. So we can assume this little girl grew up loved, that she grew up being able to worship because her dad's position in the synagogue, right? For 12 years, this beautiful family around her. And then over here, the woman with the blood, she had 12 years of loneliness. We don't know how old she was, but we know for the same amount of 12 years, this woman If she was married, if she had children, she would have been isolated from them. If she wasn't married and didn't have children yet, she wouldn't have had the opportunity to have a husband. She'd been alone. And on top of all of that, do you see that she tried to go to the doctors, multiple doctors. And instead of getting better, it says she got worse. She's still in pain. She's still dying on the inside slowly. And now, she's also broke. She has nowhere to go. But then she hears about a man. Verse 27, she had heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, if I but touch his clothes, I will be made well. I think there's a lot of us in the room or watching online who we've heard about Jesus, and we've kind of stopped there. Or maybe you even you'd say you believe in Jesus. You've seen what he's done for other people. You believe the stories to be true. You believe that he is a God who can heal, who can comfort, who can bring peace when no peace should be possible. But to believe is one thing, and to have great faith is another. To have great faith, there has to be action. So this woman, she heard, and then she came. And as she came and she got closer to Jesus, she reached out and she touched. She touched him. She didn't stay back on the curb. I imagine what would have happened if she saw this giant crowd in front of her and she just stood back and watched. She wouldn't have received a miracle because she didn't ask for it. She didn't go. She didn't reach out. But she believed, and her faith was leading her to action. She said, I'm going to go and I'm going to touch because I believe that I'll be made well. And she was. Verse 29, immediately, her hemorrhage stopped. And she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And immediately aware that the power had gone from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and he said, who touched my clothes? It worked, right? She should not have been in that crowd. She would have been, every single person she bumped into would have been made unclean. But she had faith, and it says immediately when she touched, she was healed. So what we thought was the interruption in this story was actually the miracle. Sometimes the interruption is the miracle, but we have to be willing to slow down and to create space for it, right? And this miracle continues to get even better. But first, Jesus is looking around and he wants to know, who is this woman? He doesn't want to let her slip away unnoticed, which I think she would have been happy. She was healed. The thing that she had been waiting for 12 years finally happened. She received her healing. And I think she would have been more than content to slip back into the crowd and go unnoticed. But Jesus had something greater for her. Take a look at this picture. This is kind of what I picture the crowd to have looked like. Jesus is looking for this woman. Can you identify any individual person in this picture? No. It is just like a mob, like a sea of people. And Jesus is looking around and he says, who touched me? I love the disciples. Oftentimes it's Peter who says things like this in verse 31. And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing on you? How can you say, who touched me? Right? They're like, Jesus, don't you mean who didn't touch you? What kind of question is that? Everyone is touching you. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Jesus knew that there was a difference between casually bumping into him, a difference between being in his presence, bumping shoulders with him, and intentionally reaching out for him in faith. He said he felt the power come out of him in this girl. He didn't want to let her slip away. Verse 32, he looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down, and told him the whole truth. The story is depicted in Matthew and Luke as well, and I really like how Luke describes this scene in Luke 8:47. He says, when the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him. She declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. She's trying to hide. And she realizes, okay, this isn't working. He's not going to give this up. He's not going to let me go. So she comes, Jesus. She falls down on his feet just like Jairus did. In the same way, she falls down by his feet. She says, Jesus, it was me. I know I shouldn't even be here right now. I know that I'm breaking all the rules. I know that I went about this all the wrong way. But I heard about you. I heard what you did for Peter's mother-in-law. I heard what you did for the paralyzed man that came down on the roof to see you. I heard, and so I had to come. And I thought if I could just get close enough to you, Jesus, if I could just touch part of your robe, I knew that you would heal me. And it worked. I'm no longer bleeding. You have cured me. Can you imagine the power of that testimony? And also in that moment when Jesus draws her out publicly, remember how she was isolated for so long? What is Jesus doing now? He is restoring her socially. He already restored her physically, and now he has restored her socially so that everyone knows that this woman is healed. She is clean. And even more than that, look here at verse 30-4. It says, he said to her, after she confesses, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. See, interruptions can invite us into intimacy with God. This woman, she came into the crowd as a nameless woman who's defined by her issue, by her problem. She came not being known by anyone, but she left as a daughter. Jesus didn't want to let her slip away. He wanted to interrupt her plans, and he wanted to get her attention because he wanted her to know how gracious God was to her. And that she wasn't just a woman with the issue of blood. Now she was a healed woman, and more than that, now she was a daughter. She is someone who is known, who is seen by Jesus. And this whole time, kind of take your camera, pan it back. Where was Jairus? Remember the dad who was really desperate for his daughter? She wasn't just sick. Remember, she was dying. She had maybe minutes. Jairus is standing over here. He's watching this delay, this interruption of this woman who on the outside seemed fine, right? I don't know. It doesn't tell us what Jairus said to Jesus, but if it was me and one of my kids was dying and Jesus promised me that we would go and we would heal her, I'd be having some words with Jesus, right? I would be telling Jesus, you promised me. This woman can wait. We don't have time for this, right? But Jesus was inviting Jairus into a deeper sort of faith. Verse 35, we see where Jairus is. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house, from Jairus' house, and said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the teacher of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. Believe what? I was believing. I came to you. I came for the healing. It didn't happen. It didn't happen how I thought it was going to happen. And at this moment right here, Jairus thinks it's over. He thinks that the opportunity for the miracle is gone because there's an interruption. But what Jesus is showing us here is that interruptions, often what we see as interruptions, God sees as an opportunity. See, everybody knew that Jesus was Lord over healing and over diseases, but here Jesus was about to show them that he was Lord over life and death. So let's see how our story finishes with Jairus. In verse 37, Jesus allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brothers of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, Jairus, he saw commotion. People were weeping and wailing loudly. When he entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Or they're like, "No, we know what sleeping looks like. This is not it. This is not it." So it says, then Jesus put him outside. He's kind of like, if you don't believe me, you don't get to be a part of this miracle. He pushed them all outside. And he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, the 3 disciples, and went to where the child was. He took her by the hand, and he said to her, "Talitha cum," which was her native tongue in Arabic for "little girl, get up." And immediately, the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something good to eat. He's like, everything's fine, just feed her. There was purpose in that delay. It didn't seem like it in the moment, but what did Jairus come to Jesus asking for? Healing. What did Jesus give him? Resurrection. He asked for healing, but the miracle that he got was resurrection, something that he wouldn't have even known to ask for, because who does that? No one. You can't do that. You can't bring someone from the dead back to life. But Jesus did. Jesus did. And the only thing that he asked of Jairus was to believe, to trust. He commended the woman for her great faith, and then he was giving Jairus an opportunity to show his great faith as well. And I love this story because I just see Jesus dealing with interruption after interruption after interruption. Nothing is going as planned, but everything is under God's control, right? Everything is happening the way that it should happen. And I think so often we are so quick when interruptions and distractions come into our lives. We are so quick to complain, to be frustrated, to be mad at God, to dismiss them. I'm just wondering, what would it look like for us to view our interruptions this week in a different lens? How can we view our interruptions as that monastic bell? Every time something happens that we weren't expecting, you hear that little bell go off. I think, okay, Jesus, what are you trying to teach me here? What are you trying to form inside of me here? I have 2 things for us this week. 2 things that Jesus has been teaching me. One is that we need to initiate interruptions. I think there's a lot of us that have some area of our life where we feel like we are bleeding on the inside, right? Where we feel like that relationship is too far gone to be repaired. We got the diagnosis this week. You have the child that's gone wayward. right? Sometimes our interruptions are not as cute as toddlers asking us for snacks. Sometimes our interruptions are big, life-altering interruptions. And what I see here in this text is that Jesus is highly interruptible. He is highly interruptible. He wants you to come and interrupt him. He wants you to come to him. And so I want you to think this week, is there an area in your life where there is something where you need Jesus to come and interrupt? You don't want to wait until the marriage is on the brink of divorce. You feel a little drift now and you want Jesus come and interrupt us. Bring the healing, bring the mending, bring the comfort, bring the peace. You can ask him. I don't know why Jesus chooses to answer some requests and doesn't some others. We don't get to know that. But what we do see over and over in Scripture is that, remember, there were thousands of people in that crowd. Thousands. How many received a miracle that day? 2. Why those 2? They asked. They reached out. They demonstrated their faith, and they trusted that Jesus was highly interruptible. So let's initiate interruptions with the mighty God this week. 2, we need to embrace the interruptions. I don't know what's in store for you this week, but I know you're going to be interrupted. Maybe with a meeting at work that didn't go the way you planned, maybe with a spouse that's struggling with addiction, maybe with your parenting feeling too overwhelming. I don't know what it is, but I know that there are going to be interruptions throughout your week, and we can either try to run away and slide back in the crowd, or we can be brave enough to see how Jesus is trying to draw us in. We can come and we can embrace him. And so because Jesus is highly interruptible, let's go to him now in prayer together. Jesus, we are so grateful for who you are, God, that you are not the God who just sits by and watches us suffer, Jesus, but that you are the God who loves us deeply and that you desire for us to interrupt you. You are never too busy for us. You are never too much in a hurry, Lord. You care for us in ways that we can't fathom, that we do not deserve. And so, Jesus, I pray for all of us this week. I pray that we would be bold to reach out to you, that we would initiate interruptions with you. If there are places in our lives where we need your healing, your comfort, your peace, your restoration, Jesus, I pray that we would be the people who would initiate the interruption, that we would ask you to come down and to meet us where we are at, Jesus. And as we face our interruptions this week, Jesus, I pray that you would form us more into your image with each and every interruption that we face throughout this week, because there is nothing that you cannot do, God. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.